Welcome to Lecture 3. Thank you for making it this far. I think we've just about sorted out most of the technical glitches now, and hopefully from here on in everything just gets better. Hopefully you'll find today's lecture to be an interesting one. It's about Ali Shariati and his intellectual influence on the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Now, this was a revolution that took the world by surprise. People reacted badly to it as its progress became more and more theocratic and more captured by the clerical establishment. But at first, there was a much, let us say, enthusiasm. The French philosopher Michel Foucault called it something new. In other words, quite apart from the debates as to the material or the cultural foundations for revolution, he perceived in what happened in Tehran in particular as something which had been unprecedented. That is, a revolution that had spiritual foundations. And this is something that I want to explore in this particular lecture, delving into the work of Ali Shariati. But before we look at Shariati, it's probably as well to look at a bit of the background of what we today call Iran. Of course, this was Persia in days of old. The legendary civilization and culture of Persia. It probably intrudes upon our knowledge by all kinds of, let us say, almost comic book interventions in our cultural history, like the semi-animated film 300, which tells possibly an exaggerated, if not apocryphal, story of the stand of 300 Spartans, always forgetting their 300 Theban allies, at the gates of Thermopylae against what were meant to have been 2 million Persians. It probably wasn't 2 million. This was a story of great grandeur in Greek history, of course, a heroic resistance. I've made a visit to Thermopylae just to see what the terrain was like. It doesn't quite accord to the terrain of the story, although, of course, geological and geographical features change over several hundred years' time. From the Persian point of view, they were probably seeking to quell a pirate nation. The Greeks were not quite as civilized as they made themselves out to be. That came later with the restoration of Athens and the advent of what we today recognize as a forerunner of democracy. The Persians regarded themselves as highly civilized, and in fact, as representing the very apogee of civilization. So that's a slight corrective to the prevailing Western view, which in fact began in Greek times, seeking to disparage the accomplishment of the Persians. And in fact, this is meant to have been one of the animations for Alexander the Great, to show the grandeur, in fact, of the Greeks by attempting to conquer Persia. And he certainly tried to do this in the 300s when, having become king of Macedon at the appallingly young age of 20, set out to do exactly this task of conquering the great empire of Persia. Now, in the Greek epics, he dies at a young age, probably of malaria, after he had defeated the Persian armies. In the Persian stories, he doesn't die. He becomes a king, but becomes acculturated. He becomes greatly impressed by Persian ways and effectively becomes something emblematic of the cosmopolitanism of Persian civilization. He became a great scientist, taking forward some of the lessons he had learnt at the footsteps of Aristotle, the Greek teacher, but extending this kind of naturalistic and scientific thinking into Persian culture and also establishing a debate within Persian intellectual history. So when we look at one of the great poems of Persian civilization, that by Attar, usually translated as the speech of the birds, sometimes as the conference of the birds, and my own preferred translation is the parliament of the birds. These birds debate in a beautiful epic poem about which is superior, the thought of Islam or the thought of Alexander. Don't forget, at this point in time, in the 12th century, it was Persia and the surrounding regions, what we would now call Iraq, for instance, that preserved basically Western culture. Aristotelian, Platonic thought had all but disappeared in any sophisticated form in medieval Europe, but it was curated and developed in the Middle East. And the thought of Alexander, as it was called, was a necessary set piece in the intellectual debates as to how to think in terms of agency on the one hand, Greek thought, and being a subject under heaven, under God, in terms of Islamic thought. Now, don't forget that Islamic thought had only really come to Persia around about 700. Before then, you had a very, very interesting religion called Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism probably had its roots about 2000 BC, and then lasted, as I said, to about the 7th century AD. And it was one of these amazing religions which has largely disappeared now, not entirely so. There are still pockets of Zoroastrianism in Persia or Iran itself, in India, but also pockets in Europe. Freddie Mercury, the lead singer for Queen, for instance, was a Zoroastrian. And this was a religion of great ceremony. Some of the ceremonies of constantly washing hands and of politesse of a very, very intricate sort have been inherited and adapted by today's Baha'i, a religion that is greatly persecuted in today's Iran. Zoroastrianism is tolerated in its minuscule representation because that represented a religion before the Prophet. Baha'i, however, represents a religion after the Prophet, and that is not meant to be tolerated. But it had a huge influence at the time of its enunciation. Its holy book, the Avesta, which was actually written quite a number of years, some centuries after the foundation of the religion itself, was one of the first great holy books and is a book of very great ritual, a very, very great protocol in terms of how to behave as a righteous and as a cleansed person in the eyes of God. But one of the things that it did was to establish a vision of equivalence in heaven. Heaven was not just the creature of God, but it was very, very much a manifestation of God's struggle with, essentially equivalence with, the forces of darkness. Both existed in a symbiotic union. You couldn't really have one without the other. A sort of Manichaean vision of the world. But this kind of Manichaean vision probably informed the foundations of early Christianity. When Constantine legitimized, officialized the church in the Roman Empire, he probably deliberately allowed the absorption of a great number of Zoroastrian figures, motifs, legends, and beliefs into the new official Christianity. The Council of Nicaea chose those Gospels that had already been influenced by the cult of Mithras, a descendant cult of Zoroastrianism that had been greatly influential among the Roman legions who were fighting the Persians on the frontiers of Rome. So things like the virgin birth, the flight into Egypt, those seem to be borrowed from Zoroastrian legend. So its impact today on other religions is very strong, even though itself, as a religion, only has a minority following. But it represents part of the genealogy of Persia as it slowly became modern Iran. The other part that I should comment upon is, of course, the very, very first Bill of Human Rights. That's what we would call it today. Was published in Persia. The biblical story about the release of the Jewish people in the 500s BC to return home to Jerusalem after the Babylonian captivity to rebuild their temple, that was probably a byproduct of the promulgation of Cyrus, which established in a document which we call the Cyrus Cylinder, one of the two surviving copies, contemporaneous with Cyrus himself, of the cylinder remains in the British Museum to this day. So once COVID dies down and you get a chance to visit the British Museum right beside SOAS, have a look at the Cyrus Cylinder. That's the first Bill of Human Rights, basically guaranteeing religious freedom throughout the entire Persian Empire. So what you have really in all of these disparate forms, even before the foundation of Islam in Persia, in, as I say, about 700 AD, you had this vast cosmopolitan history, probably epitomized more than anything else in the great epic poem of 1000 AD, the Shahnameh. That is the Book of the Kings. And this is a legendary cycle, a huge poem to rival the Odyssey and the Iliad, where Persian heroes contest against all kinds of threats to righteous civilization, but also has passages in it which are quite clearly drawn from recent history of the struggle against Rome. There's a fantastic passage where Vespasian, the Roman emperor, is taken to meet a Zoroastrian sage, who then asks the Roman emperor, "Why do you wage war against us?" And then takes him on a tour, an intellectual tour, of all the great religions of the world, and one by one saying none of these religions, Buddhism, everything, clear through to Christianity, as not mandating the kind of imperial conquest being undertaken by Rome at that point in time, and referencing the conversion of Rome to Christianity and basically asking the emperor, well, does Christ want you to amass all of these treasures at the expense of other people, to turn their countries into rivers and fields of blood? You store your treasures till they reach heaven, but where is your humility? Where is your actual Christianity? And it's a tour de force of cosmopolitan and ecumenical religious teaching. So this sense of inclusiveness, of religious freedom and religious understanding marked a country which today has obviously fallen on bad times in terms of public representation. So we're going to have a look at what has been happening in recent years in what we now call Iran. In the years after World War One, of course, what we had was a huge struggle among the imperial powers for influence in the Middle East and the surrounding region. Nothing was spared to ensure that spheres of influence were created, particularly by the British and the French in this part of the world. However, you had a very, very curious situation in what became known as Iran. That is, it had sufficient capacity to form governments which were recognized to some extent as functioning, legitimate governments capable of modernity. In other words, of meeting the West to a certain extent on its own terms. And what you had very, very much was the sense that here you had great potential, but particularly insofar as this potential included the discovery of oil, for instance, then this increased the whole sense of wishing on the part of the West to have a purchase in the fortunes of Iran. So what you had very, very much was the overthrow of the elected prime minister of Iran, Mossadegh, an overthrow that had been plotted by both what we now know as British Petroleum, BP, in its antecedent form, and by the CIA, wanting very, very much to have a Western control of the oil potential and revenues of Iran. And they installed on the throne the person that we now call the Shah of Iran. He was very much in power from the 1940s through to 1979, the year of the Iranian Revolution, which we shall discuss shortly. And the Western powers were extremely anxious to ensure that he remained in power. They were prepared to invest really quite a huge amount of money into his regime. So one of the reasons why Iran became one of the richest countries in that part of the world, certainly in terms of per capita income, in terms of overall GNP, was not only because of oil, but because of very, very favored treatment on the part of the Western powers. And the Shah was seen as a reforming, westernizing figure, very, very much in favor of the alliance with the West, but also two other things. First of all, he was draconian in terms of his authoritarianism and his persecution of those who dissented from his rule. And this is not only people who were in favor of a more pluralistic and more freedom-embracing Iran, but of course he knew that his own claim to the throne was very much substantiated only by Western intervention. There are other claimants to the throne, some of whom live in exile here in London, amidst quite a large and quite an influential, they still call themselves Persian, diaspora. So anyone who opposed the Shah was subjugated, dissent was suppressed, and it became a police state. The Shafak, the secret police, was without mercy. And neo-Marxist groups that tried to foment insurrection in small pockets in the countryside, if they were captured, they faced no mercy. They were pretty much shot on sight. And because of that, they earned the name of being martyrs. Now, this is, of course, very strange in terms of contemporary usage of that term, because they were secular martyrs. They were neo-Marxist martyrs. They were dying for a more egalitarian version, a Marxist version of Iran. But this is really quite influential as a forerunner to the contribution of Shariati. What you have with Shariati was the most unusual person, someone very, very learned in the ways of Iran and its history, someone very learned in terms of knowledge of Persian culture and particularly poetry and philosophy, but also someone very, very knowledgeable about religion, particularly the Shia form of Islamic religion, which was practiced in Iran. Iran being the stronghold of international Shia, just like Saudi Arabia is the stronghold of international Sunni Islam. There is a confessional divide there, which of course has become heavily politicized in today's world. It was not always the case. There was very clearly religious rivalry and a huge amount of discrimination based on which branch of confessionalism you belonged to in the Islamic world. But the politicization to the extent of today's bitterness is something which is relatively recent. And of course, the superpowers have been involved at certain key junctures in terms of prosecuting their own agendas through exploiting the confessional divides. But what you had with Shariati was a young man. He grew up in Iran, and he died 2 years before the revolution. The revolution took place in 1979. He died a broken man in 1977, having spent a couple of years in the Shah of Iran's prisons, where he was basically forced to recant the progressive views that he had published and lectured upon in the years before his arrest. Now, the formation of these views is extremely interesting. He won a scholarship to study in Paris in the 1950s. He went to Sorbonne to write his doctorate. He did complete it successfully. But of course, the Paris of the 1950s was not any place. It was itself recovering from German Nazi occupation in World War II, which had lasted through to 1945. Many of the philosophers who were gaining huge popularity and influence in the 1950s had themselves, in their captivity in German prisoner of war camps, been greatly influenced by German thought. The influence of Heidegger, for instance, upon Jean-Paul Sartre and his version of existentialism had been a very profound influence. So you had already in French thought a certain, let us say, reluctant but very real cosmopolitanism, an international fusion of influences, as it were. And it was into this milieu that people like Shariati and, in fact, people like Frantz Fanon were thrust. A very experimental intellectual culture. What we took to be, for instance, the sexual revolution of the 1960s was already underway in the philosophical circles of Paris in the 1950s. When you look at the background of Simone de Beauvoir's great book, The Second Sex, pretty much regarded as the foundation or the seminal text of contemporary feminism, that was set against a fair amount of experimentation in terms of sexual relations, in which the rights of women to seduce and to enjoy sexual relations was as much one of the foundation causes as social equality, economic equality, and philosophical equality. So it was, let us say, a volatile environment, but an international one. Not just in philosophical circles, but artistic circles. Picasso had passed through there. The symbolist schools were located there. The cafes, the bars where both artists and philosophers would sit, drink, debate. These were institutions which had a huge magnetic power. And Sartre, in particular, was able to draw to himself a huge circle of acolytes. And he was prepared to put out for them, whether he knew them well or not, and it's debatable how well he knew people like Fanon and Shariati, but he took the care to be agreeable to writing prefaces for their great works. So, of course, he wrote the preface for Fanon's great work, The Wretched of the Earth. In fact, most people have read Sartre's preface and haven't actually read Fanon's work. But because of this kind of endorsement, what you had was the capacity of Fanon to be taken seriously by the world's intellectual elites and particularly by revolutionary elites. The Wretched of the Earth is still one of the great texts of uprising. Now, Shariati, in fact, knew Fanon and translated The Wretched of the Earth into Farsi. And Sartre also wrote prefaces for Shariati's work. Now, what you had here, therefore, was something which was a fusion of an already cosmopolitan French thought, European thought, particularly to do with ontological and agential capacity. Oneself as an individual could make a difference in the world. One was not just subservient to greater forces, but one could, in one's own ontological being, make a difference. However, this created a tension. In what way does the ontological self deal with structures, superstructures, infrastructures, etc., to deal with systems, to deal with governments, to do with world orders? So what you had in terms of seeking for a way of addressing a contradiction, in fact, about the freedom of the individual, you had to have a parallel sense of the structure of the world. And what you had, and this I think was epitomized very, very much in Fanon's work, you had the incorporation of what we now call dependency theory, Latin American dependencia thought, which spoke of the world as levels of accumulation leading ever upwards and ever to a more globalized setting, a chain of accumulation benefiting those who are great at the developed and imperial and capitalist top end of the world. But local elites were allowed to benefit so that they would continue to contribute to the chain of upwards accumulation. It's still an extremely influential theory of international economic relations. I think you will find many members of SOAS, particularly in the Development Studies Department, but also elsewhere, who would be basically subscribers to this way of analyzing international economic relations. But in the 1950s, it was having a profound impact again in places like Europe. So you have in Fanon's work, for instance, some kind of amalgamation between dependencia thought, but also thought to do with the ontological dependence of the individual, the existential nature of capacity to be, despite the world being absurd. And don't forget, it certainly seemed absurd at that point in time. If you think that we're chaotic here in Great Britain today, and of course we are, you have to think about the post-World War II world where nothing worked in terms of the huge struggle to put the world together again. So in the face of this absurdity, integrity of self, but being able to address the economic structures of the world, to critique unfair gain, but at the same time to declare oneself as having moral capacity not to be contaminated by this system. You can see in a capsule the huge attraction of this to young intellectuals, not only in France itself, but those who had come from the outside, like Fanon from Martinique and the Caribbean. He adopted the Algerian cause, of course, while he was in France. Shariati from Iran. African leaders like Senghor, who became the first president of Senegal, took a more moderated and perhaps some would say a more nuanced view of what he learned in the Paris of the 1950s. But altogether, there was this huge crucible of factors influencing an entire international generation of young intellectuals who went back to their home bases and were able to be extremely influential, which meant that Shariati went back from the Paris of the 1950s full of different influences. Now, these influences were threefold. Certainly, he learnt a very great deal from his French inspirations, the philosophical circles that he found in Paris, but he'd also learned in terms of observing across the Channel, looking at Great Britain, about the organization, particularly of the Church of England. Now, he thought, well, look, if you can organize a religion like that, which is coherent and which is national, and which has a synod in which lay people are able to have influence in the debates of those who are learned in scriptural terms. In other words, the bishops and the lay members were all equal members of the synod. Then this might be an instrumentality by which you could take forward the church, the Shia church in Iran, because the view of Shariati was that Shia had become moribund in Iran. Not moribund as useless. He saw great uses in it. He saw great potential in it. but moribund in terms of its capacity to organize itself to face the modern world, and in particular to face the kind of suppressive and indeed repressive regime of the Shah with his secret police, with American backing, and in the face of the provision of plenty, of material provision for the Iranian people. In the face of all of this, a clergy that had not changed in terms of its self-organization for many, many years was, in Shariati's eyes, probably worse than useless. However, he was not the only one who felt like that, and this is where we look at the entry of a young cleric, the person who became the Ayatollah Khomeini. Of course, by the time of the Iranian Revolution of 1979, he was being portrayed as this wizened creature with a long white beard who was an arch conservative to the point of being some kind of Islamic fascist. This is probably an unfair representation. But in any case, the young Khomeini was a very idealistic young cleric. He had been a cleric all his adult life. He was a lover of poetry, and not many people know that he in fact wrote poetry. I've been unable to uncover any translations of his original poetry, so I can't tell you whether they were regarded as good or bad poetry. But he was trying to write in terms of the poetic tradition of great thinkers and writers, poets and philosophers who expressed their teaching in verse, people like Hafez and people like Rumi. Now, don't forget that many of us know Rumi because of this huge industry of greeting cards and chocolate box extracts of pretty little lines that seem to be very, very full of wisdom, but above all, very, very pretty. His work was far more profound than that, and it has all kinds of allusions of a philosophical nature which really require a very great deal of tutoring in order fully to understand his reference points. But what you had, and again, this speaks to today's division of Islam into separated groups, but you had in Rumi, who basically had both Sunni and Shia influences, but it speaks of a Rumi who used the kind of imagery of transcendence which we would normally associate with Sufism today, the possibility of the individual transcendental link with God. It wasn't so unusual in days gone by for a fusion of these different influences that today speak to absolute differences and schisms in the Islamic world. There were differences, of course, but there was more of an ecumenical sense about Islam for many, many years, particularly during the time of the 12th century when great documents like the Parliament of the Birds was written. So what you had in this amalgamation of influences within the poetry of Rumi was something which Shariati in turn amalgamated with the influences we picked up in Paris, existential thought, the ontological capacity for all kinds of things, including rebellion, a neo-Marxist dependencia critique of the world, and a sense of religious organization which could be efficacious in the face of the modern world. And this is a very, very bold amalgamation. Now, the work of Rumi is very influential in the sense of how he tried to put forward the logic of his work. There are some things that are rendered not logical in any Western sense. In other words, you're going to apply English analytical linguistic philosophy and analysis, pure formal logic to his work. It's not going to work. I don't know how many of you have got philosophy backgrounds and had to train in formal logic and an analytical philosophy. I had to do that. It was an extremely dry and a completely arid and, as far as I could see, a completely useless formation. People like Wittgenstein, for instance, rebelled precisely against that while exploiting some of its tools to prove its essential uselessness. So if you apply that kind of formalistic, where is the rationality question to Shariati's work, you can't find it. But he relied upon the device that you find in Arabic and other Middle Eastern thought, and that is the power of the metaphor. So the power of the metaphor, the sudden illuminating transcendental leap in logic that all the same makes sense because poetically it is resonant. In other words, taking precisely the device that made Rumi such a successful poet in literary terms and applying that as a key element of the way that he reasoned. So what you had was the enunciation of a philosophy which was poetic, and to the extent that you can make some kind of relationship between poetry and spirituality, God doesn't have to be logical. He doesn't have to explain himself in terms of humanity, and certainly not in terms of humanity's logic. Using poetry as a device to establish the transcendental capacity of reason beyond analysis. This was how he achieved his great writings. Now, this meant that what he was trying to do was to put forward a spiritual Shia, which was modern, which was egalitarian, equalitarian in terms of the desirability of a division of wealth, putting all of these things together as a challenge to the church and asking for it to become more modern, capacious, and able to adopt agendas like this. Whether Ayatollah Khomeini actually came to adopt such an agenda is open to question. As I said, he had an interesting youth, known among those in the clerical circles as a man of poetry. But he was regarded by the Shah of Iran at quite an early stage as being dangerous, as having the organizational charisma to mobilize the clergy, whether it was moribund organizationally or not. Basically, the Shah wasn't going to take any chances. So he exiled Khomeini for 15 years. He came back in 1979. He basically came back 2 weeks after the Shah had fled the uprising in the streets of Tehran. But most of these years of exile were spent in Iraq. Now, this is in itself is really quite outstanding because what you have in Iraq is a Sunni confessional affiliation. And here you have a very senior cleric from the Shia persuasion. And yet he was treated hospitably. He was given exile. He was given safe exile. As the years passed, and it was a decade and a half, coming to the end of his exile in Iraq, it was Saddam Hussein himself who came to the Ayatollah and said, look, the Americans are putting too much pressure on us. I actually can't keep you here anymore. But I don't want to throw you out with nowhere to go. It was actually a very, very apologetic, personal visit on the part of Saddam Hussein to Khomeini. So Saddam said, look, I've arranged an aeroplane to take you to Paris tonight. We've talked to the French. They'll accept you. You can continue your exile in Paris. So he was in Paris for about a year or so before he came back to Iran. And although Shariati had by that stage not only left, but in fact had died, he died in 1977, what you had was his legacy in terms of intellectual debate among exile circles in Paris. And so he would have become aware, Khomeini, in terms of his own exile, of his intellectual forebear who had been in Paris before him. Not only that, it seems that the Palestinian diaspora came to Khomeini and gave him seminars and lessons in Dependency thought and in the thought of Francis Fanon. So what you had in quite a short time was the formation of Khomeini before he went back. Now, how much of this was influential in the way that he tried to run Iran after he came to power? That's open to question, of course. At first sight, it wasn't very influential at all. At the same time, the deliberate reverence in which someone like Shariati is held does suggest the need of the clerical establishment that attained power after the revolution of 79 to be able to be identified in some way with someone who is becoming recognized as a great and a seminal thinker, someone who represented the, let us say, antique, ancient, but nevertheless very valuable cosmopolitan sophistication of Persian civilization, something that even a theocratic regime could not live without, almost as it were, needed to be endorsed by a certain intellectual genealogy. And particularly so when you look at the progress of the Iranian Revolution, it wasn't straight away the victory of the Ayatollahs. We talk about the 100 days of the Tehran Spring, where for 100 days after the overthrow of the Shah, huge creative and intellectual freedom was the order of the day. More books, more recordings on old-fashioned cassette tapes, more poetry readings. Everything of that sort seemed to be in explosive abundance for that point in time. Those of you who have been at SOAS for a while before your master's year will know Professor Annabel Shrebani. She wrote a book with her then husband, Mohammed Shrebani. And what you have there in that book, Ali Mohammadi and Annabel Shrebani, let me get their names right. They were actually there for those 100 days of the Tehran Spring and describe it in thrilling detail, this explosion of joy and creativity. Now, you couldn't just abolish that. You had to somehow bring that on side, despite what became a bloodletting in terms of the struggle which led to the final triumph of the clerical faction, accompanied, of course, by the mobs in the street ransacking the US Embassy and holding hostage several of the diplomats in the US Embassy, something for which the United States has never forgiven Iran and which remains very, very much at the heart of the antipathy that the United States still holds towards Iran. And don't forget that the rescue efforts inaugurated by President Jimmy Carter failed. The helicopters broke down. It was a huge embarrassment for the United States in that its diplomats had been taken hostage and they couldn't effect a rescue. So this kind of lingering resentment has come down to this day, but also a resentment at the capacity of Iran. When people talk about the capacity to build nuclear weapons, this may or may not be an actual project. It, in fact, probably is an actual project that has been restrained for obvious reasons right now. But it also speaks of a certain respect for the capacity of the Iranians in terms of their modernity and their ability to accomplish significant feats of science in their own modernity. And in fact, even now, when you go to Tehran, and I think I said to you last week I've not been, despite many invitations, but I have many friends there in Tehran, including people who teach political science and international relations. They teach an undergraduate curriculum in international relations, which is every bit as sophisticated and Western as anything that you're going to find here in Great Britain. One of my good friends, Mahmoud Sarir Galam, took his PhD at the University of Southern California underneath James Rosnow, the late James Rosnow. with whom I used to hang out at terribly boring international conferences on international relations. But basically, Mahmoud teaches James Rosnow's syllabus, which is an extremely sophisticated, basically Western syllabus of international relations. And the teaching of continental philosophy is also highly advanced in the universities of Iran. So you basically have this curious phenomenon of a religious state and an academic establishment which is modern, both in philosophical and theoretical social scientific terms, but also in terms of the modern pure sciences, like physics, like nuclear physics, that is sufficiently advanced to give nightmares both to the West and to, of course, a country like Israel. Because, of course, if Iran should actually produce a nuclear weapon, then what you suddenly have in a region in which there's been Israeli hegemony, particularly in military terms, you suddenly have a balance of power. And that is not something that many people would wish to see. So you have great stirrings in that country. But in order to grapple with this modernity, as I said, they had to at least go through the motions of adopting Shariati as some kind of apostle, intellectual apostle of the revolution. So he's revered there. Even though when you look at his works on freedom, these are not exactly things that at first sight would seem palatable to a conservative clerical establishment. And it's also apparent in the so-called theocratic institutions and theocratic constitution of Iran. Now, this is one of the terrible downsides of being an academic. You spend your life reading constitutions in detail. So if you want to know about the constitutions over time, there have been several of them of Hamas, for instance. Please, that has been the subject of many sleepless nights. Well, they should have been sleepless, except I would fall asleep out of sheer boredom. But not so much as the boredom I experienced in reading the very, very long constitution of Iran, which is meant to be theocratic, but is full of all kinds of what they themselves call exceptional clauses. Because a theocratic constitution can't run a modern world. If you've got to say, but notwithstanding, then in this situation, this, in this situation, that, and you've got all of these exceptions to the rule to cater for modernity. So it's a very, very strange composite of influences. Has it become more modern? Well, the church has certainly become far more powerful. It's not the red Shia with which Shariati became associated. Red as in neo-Marxist, but red also in terms of its liberating mission. Red also, and this has been an influence, red in terms of its capacity to recognize martyrdom. Now, you've got to bear in mind that outside of its own region, Iran has not been responsible for any great international insurgency or any great act of international terrorism. You can point the finger at Saudi Arabia, for instance, certainly for 9/11, and the attacks on New York, but you can't point the finger at Iran for that. Certainly in countries like the Lebanon, surrounding areas, there are many instances of Western hostages being held by agents of Iran. And in fact, those of you who wish to follow the career, he's still alive, of the great United Nations diplomat, Jean Domenico Pico. Basically, he secured the release of many of the Western hostages by allowing himself to be kidnapped not once but 4 times on the streets of Lebanon, so that he'd get a fast track to being dragged before the leaders of the kidnappers and then negotiating in person, face to face, both for his and for their release. A step into the dark. And as Pico said, well, look, this is the reality of diplomacy. If you want to take it seriously, you're either successful or you're dead. You can't not take sides. The only person who doesn't have to take sides is dead. You don't get too much courage like that in today's diplomacy. Never been properly recognized, but his work is an example to everybody with true aspirations and idealism to be an actor with ontological capacity in today's diplomatic world. So it's not been a sheer, even in the most conservative hands, that has exported itself as an international instrument of terror. It has been an instrument that has sought to develop an extremely modern and scientific and defensible Iran. And that, as I said, has given pause for thought to the Israelis, to the United States in particular, and to a certain extent to this country. Curiously, the country that seems to understand Iran best is France. Perhaps it's no accident that the French hosted both Shariati and Khomeini in the days gone by. So you're looking at a thinker who probably didn't have the influence that he would have liked, but who cannot be ignored in today's Iran. What you had in the regime of the Shah was a looking back beyond the advent of Islam, looking back to the days of Persian glory, at the time of the great curating and development of Greek thought, the thought of Alexander, looking back to the splendors of civilization in the city of Persepolis. He tried to make Persepolis into a great showpiece. All the vulgar 1960s and 1970s light shows and things like that. What Saddam Hussein also tried to do in the ruins, which he partly rebuilt in a very vulgar fashion of Babylon. The Shah wasn't quite as vulgar as Saddam Hussein in Babylon, but Persepolis seemed to be the symbol of the civilization of the days gone by. And in fact, this has always been recognized in Western literature. The great Elizabethan playwright, contemporary of Shakespeare's, Christopher Marlowe, he wrote a great play called Tamburlaine the Great after the career of Timur, the great conqueror who came out of what is today Uzbekistan and conquered most of Transcaucasia, Afghanistan, for instance, right up to the gates of Persia. Once you get beyond Herat, the city which is in the northwest corner of Afghanistan, a city known in its antiquity for having very wise queens, and of course a region very rich in terms of certain grapes used for the very best kinds of wine, derivatives of which are our Shiraz grapes that we use in a very, very specially favored blend of wine today. What you had was the aspirations of an actual figure reduced or portrayed in Elizabethan poetry in the play by Christopher Marlowe as Tamburlaine muses to his lieutenants. He's not passing brave to be a king, and march in triumph through Persepolis. To be able to represent yourself as the ruler of Persepolis was to represent yourself as ruler of the center of the civilized world. This is a legacy which the Americans took a long time fully to understand. In the end, John Kerry, the Secretary of State underneath President Obama, who basically negotiated from the American side the nuclear deal with Iran, which was a workable deal no matter what John Bolton and President Trump has to say about it. The French in particular were very, very keen on this deal. They could see that if properly monitored, it could certainly work. Kerry made very little progress in the early rounds of the negotiation process, although he was greatly impressed by the opposing delegations with whom he negotiated. And then one day he basically realized, well, look, we're coming to them as enemies, and we're treating them antagonistically. We're treating them as somehow not our equals. So Kerry undertook a crash course in Iranian and Persian history, civilization, and he himself credits in his memoirs, Every Day is Extra, he credits that moment of recognition. Well, look, if I treat them as hugely equal, with this huge, sophisticated, cosmopolitan history, the history of the splendors of civilization, if they recognize that I recognize them in that way, maybe progress is possible. And in his memoirs, he basically says that was the breakthrough moment. And I believe this. The foreign minister with whom he was negotiating, I met him last year. I've been helping the government of Qatar in its argument with Saudi Arabia. And one of the rewards for this kind of thing is that you get invited to showpiece meetings like the Doha Forum, one of the great diplomatic occasions of the world where every man and his dog and every woman and her dog is present. And just to be seen there is meant to be some kind of mark of prestige. And to be seen there and asked to speak at one of the sessions is also something which people give their eye teeth for. So, I got my little petty rewards in this world. But the speech of the Iranian foreign minister, knowing that the US Secretary of State and Ivanka Trump were also attending the conference, this is sending of messages, was such a sophisticated piece of diplomatic communication without seeming to point fingers at anyone. It was so gentle, so diplomatic, but so invitational of reading between the lines. And don't forget, almost everyone there has got a diplomatic background, so everyone reads between the lines instantly. But one of the most sophisticated presentations that I've heard for many a long year, and the Americans would have gotten the message, look, we're civilized, gentle people. He did all of this in perfect English, completely grammatical, nuanced, well-paced. The effect was of a person who was more sophisticated than any of the Americans present. So that was really quite an experience. And the Secretary of State for the Treasury would probably have taken the message back to the rather deaf ears of Mr. Bolton and Mr. Trump. Actually, I can't remember whether Bolton was still in office at that point in time. Those of you who want to, as it were, read a very contrary view of Iran can read Bolton's book, In the Room Where It Happened, which is a very self-serving book, but which does depict absolutely the volatility and the lack of foundation in the foreign policy thinking of President Trump, who may or may not be president for very much longer. We shall have to wait and see about that, of course. But what I've tried to present to you today, ladies and gentlemen, is sort of like a cook's tour of Persia, Iran, Western intervention, and the effects of Western thought in a fusion with other kinds of thinking, including religious thinking and above all poetic thinking, in the personal work, the life work of Ali Shariati. One of the things that is absolutely key in Shariati's work is the concept of longing. In other words, the possibility of personal transcendental linkage with God in the Sufi fashion is there, but in the desire for this transcendence, one is consumed by a longing. And in fact, he wrote poetry about this, and the poetic device used is of a woman, a female figure, that he created. She almost certainly did not exist, but in the creation is called Solange. And Solange is someone who drowns in the English Channel. And Shariati, as the lover, is bereft. He is consumed in his writing with remorse, with loss. And it's this sense of desire, this longing for something which is unattainable, which he depicts as the reality of our relationship with God. We wish to transcend our material world. We believe we can transcend our material world, but we never quite get there. But it is our personal ontological mission to seek, to long. So what you have in this is a sort of echo of existential longing and existential despair, and let us say a rendition in his own way of the influences he came across in the courts of Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Albert Camus, all of the great figures of the French philosophical movement of the 1950s. If you're going to say who is a perfect representation of the thought of the middle of the 20th century, then it's probably Ali Shariati and the influence that he had and the acknowledgement he had to be given in terms of the uprising that led to the Iranian Revolution. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.